Okay, in this section we'll look at the differences between expressions and statements. Now you might think this section is kind of unnecessary, but as you'll see it is important. We'll talk about the comma operator that allows us to separate out expressions, and we can have multiple of those in one statement. So we'll start with expressions. Now an expression is a specific action that is to be evaluated by the computer. So note the difference between evaluation and execution. So you can execute more than one evaluation or action at a time. So here we have int x, so that's a declaration, but we also initialize it, and you can see that ends with a semicolon. Okay, that statement. We'll talk about statements in more detail in just a second, but you can see there are multiple actions or computations being performed in the single line. So first it will declare the variable x, which is of type int, so it will make space available for that. Then it will compute 3 plus 4, and then 2 minus 3, and then it will multiply those two results together, and eventually it will store that in the variable x. So as you can see, multiple computations in the single statement. You can also think of a sequence of operators and operands, so in other words variables or literals, that evaluates to or returns some value as an expression. Okay, so you can also think of that as an expression. So you won't always get a value that you can use back from an expression, mainly because a function is also considered an expression. You can see here examples of expressions. You have assignments, calculations, logical evaluations, string operations, function calls, and so on. You can see here an assignment, so x is equal to 5. You see we don't have the semicolon because that means it's a statement. This here x is equal to 5 is an expression by itself. Same with this addition here, 4 plus 5, and the relational operations as well. Again, when it comes to a void function, that simply does something. Okay, it won't return something that you can then use in addition or an assignment statement, for example. So again, an expression is some action or computation that is to be evaluated by the computer. So let's talk about statements. Statements instruct the computer to execute one or more actions. Statements in a program are executed sequentially, so we talked about this previously. You can have the execution jump from one place to another, so with a function call, for example, as we'll see later in the course, okay, in this module. But once it's finished with that function or with that name block that it'll execute, the execution will return to where it was previously and continue in that sequential manner. And you can also do branching based on various Boolean conditions, but still you essentially have sequential execution. So what does this mean? So basically the statement will instruct the computer to do something. So do this, then do that. It's not an and. You also have if this happens, then do x, else do y. So again, if else statements or branching. Then we also have loops that will allow us to execute one or more statements repeatedly while some condition is true. Most statements in C++ terminate with a semicolon, similar to how we end each sentence in the English language with a period. So do this, now do that. Each sentence ending with a period. So mostly expression statements, so where you calculate something or where you do some input or output to some stream, so to the console or to some other stream. Compound statements, selection statements, and most iteration statements do not end with a semicolon. The do while loop does end with a semicolon, but again these are also considered statements. So a compound statement, for example, is just a code block, so it ends with a closing curly bracket. So it's almost like a statement that contains one or more substatements, and those can also be compound statements, or they can be statements that simply calculate something or do stream manipulation, again console output, console input. So again, not all statements will end with a semicolon. As I've noted previously, statements can contain expressions, and you can refer to these as expression statements. A few examples of C++ statements include a declaration statement, initialization statement, expressions. It can also be a compound statement, so a code block, which of course can include one or more statements. You have selection statements, iteration, and more. So one way of remembering the difference here is a statement is executed, but an expression is evaluated. So just to recap on expressions, I noted the difference between evaluation and execution, so you can instruct the computer to do more than one evaluation or action at a time, so in a single statement. So in other words, instead of doing this and then doing that, you can do this and that and that. So multiple things within a single statement or instruction. So that's how you would kind of write it out, right, in English. So do this and that in a single instruction. Now similarly, expressions can be chained in a single statement using the comma operator. So here I have some statement right at the top where I do a few actions and then I have a comma, execute the evaluation of a couple of expressions, so expression 1 and expression 2 and expression 3. So you will evaluate all of those expressions in a single statement or a single execution. In the actual statement you can see expression 1, comma, expression 2, comma, and then expression 3, and then we end that off with a semicolon. And then we continue to the next statement. So I have a really simple program here. I'm declaring and initializing 3 variables, x, y, and z. I'm initializing all of those to 0. And with these 3 statements, I set x to 2, y to 4, and z to 6. Then I go and print those out. Build and run this and you see what we get. Similar to how we separate these out up here, we can separate these expressions out as well. So these, each one of these are expressions. So x is equal to 2 is an expression, but that is wrapped up in this statement. So it's basically going to say to the computer, go and execute this, then go and execute this, then go and execute this. Alright, so what we can do is, we can remove those semicolons, and I'll replace those with commas, and you can see that those commas now separate out these expressions. This is now a single statement. It ends with a semicolon over here. You can build and run this, and you can see it still works fine. You don't get any errors or anything like that. Now you can do it in this way if you want. You can actually do the same thing for this right here. So instead of instructing the computer to do this line, and then this line, so on, what it's going to say is, go and do all of this. So we are simply separating out these expressions with the comma operator, and we are ending this entire statement off with this semicolon. You can see this works fine. Right. Where this is useful though, is if you have an if statement. I'll just set that to true by default. Indent that. This should work fine now. That'll print out, so I might set this to false. If I run this now, you'll see we don't get any output from this program. But if I go and change those to semicolons again, so to statements, you will see only this first one will not print. So y and z will still print. Control F5 to run this, so y and z still prints, because these are individual statements. So this is very misleading and is an example of bad indentation, because you might think that all of these statements are part of this if statement, but it's not, it's just this first one. So really what you're seeing is this, okay? This makes it easier to see what is really going on. Just Control Z a few times. So what you could do instead is you can still have multiple expressions, but instead of ending each one off with a semicolon, you can do it with a comma. So basically you are doing all of this stuff in a single statement. Control F5 to run. You'll see none of those will show up now. Set this to true. Control F5 to run, and you'll see all of those print out again. But as I mentioned, this is bad practice. You won't see this often. You will typically end all of these off with a semicolon, like this, and like that. And I'm just pressing Shift Tab, so Tab to indent, Shift Tab to reduce that indentation. I hope you found this section useful, and I'll see you in the next video.